Oh, hello friends, David Vos. Beautiful day today. We're going through the cold spell. It seems like it happens every year this time. In January, it's cold. Down to freezing, which, you know, it's not bad. I'm used to Idaho and stuff like that, so this isn't bad. At night, you know, it's like down to 28 or something at night. Then it gets up into the 40s and stuff like that during the day, which is still kind of cold. No snow on the ground, but still, it's nice. So, I need to do a video today on, I thought somebody had mentioned in the comments yesterday, if I would do a video on the names, using the names and explaining the name of God in the New Testament. Because I usually just say God. I used to say I didn't like saying that word God, because as I explained, you know, it really doesn't come from the correct words. It's a misunderstanding. And I think we do need to clarify things, except that before you start really clarifying something, you got to let it ferment. You know, like, if you start telling everybody kind of some of the things I've been saying in these videos recently, if I started doing that from the very beginning, before I had a base of individuals who had listened to some of this and got it, started getting it, as we begin to understand it, make it more and more clear. As the dust begins to settle, then you can get into deeper things. But, I mean, if you just walk up to somebody and say that Jehovah is the devil, they're going to just walk away and think you're a devil worshiper or something. But I think it's appropriate that we do this video at this time. These synchronicities happen all the time. I think it was appropriate that comment was made, because I think it is time that we really got a little better understanding of who God really is, you know, according to the Greeks, or, you know, if as we say, all the nations understood who God was. They all had the pantheon of gods, the Elohim, or the plural. And we see that, as we talked about yesterday, that even Satan has his place in the pantheon, down at the bottom of the wheel. Book of Revelation says he's thrown into the bottomless pit, and then he's opened back up and they let him out again. What's the deal? Darkness and light. There's two sides to every coin. You have to have, you know, if the coin represents reality, as you know it, as you understand reality, and if you wanted to just have one side of the coin, you see how that would be impossible. In order for it to be material, you'd have to be able to touch. If it has a side, you have to touch that side. You'd have to look at it. You'd have to see it, grasp it, understand it. Well, you couldn't understand that one side without understanding there'd be another side on the bottom. Materiality has two sides, or at least some sort of two opposites, in and out. If it's a circle, the surface and that which was in the ball, the up, the down, the left, the right, there's always these two things, negative and positive, male and female. It takes a male and female to produce young, to grow, to add to your understanding, and to build on those two principles. And so negative, as we've said, just means nothing. So that which is, its opposite is that which is not. Light and darkness are the two opposites that's spoken of sometimes in the Bible. And you say, well, darkness is bad. So you could say good and evil. But does evil really exist? Well, you say, of course it does. There's lots of bad things in the world. That's evil. But if God is love, and there is no darkness in him, and he is all, in all, through all, and above all, then how could there be evil? If God was love and he wouldn't tolerate evil, then how does he tolerate it? Why does he allow it? He cannot defeat evil? You see, it's a huge philosophical question but it is the answer to the universe. One has to realize that in order to have that experience of reaching the top of the mountain, we have to suffer and go up the mountain and experience the climb and the muscles beginning to ache and the, the tingle, and you got to endure. You learn by the things in which you suffer. So you're never going to know what it tastes like to have a sweet, wonderful flavor if you didn't know there was such a thing as bitter. You couldn't say, oh, I had a wonderful day. As opposed to what? If every day was wonderful, you wouldn't know what a wonderful day was. You wouldn't be able to laugh if you'd never cried. So the universe is an amazing thing. It's complicated. But we've got to have darkness in order to have light. We've got to have winter, and then we have summer. And that's the way the universe is. So no, the devil is not supreme. He's always conquered. But for a while, somebody said they were going to unsubscribe the other day because they said somewhere where they was watching my video I did a day or two ago where I said the devil conquered Jesus. And they said, that's it. I ain't listening to more of your blasphemies. Well, that's from the Bible. That's the gospel. Jesus went to hell and was conquered by Satan for a while in hell. Now, I shouldn't say he was conquered. I don't know if I actually said that in the other video. Maybe I did, but I don't suppose he was conquered. But the point is that Jesus died. Death met up with him. He took up his cross and he willingly laid down his life. And the reason he willingly did it is because he had to learn by the things in which he suffered. So he willingly decided, I'm going to learn all these things. I'm going to go up the mountain and work hard because I want to get to the top. I want to learn. I want to experience everything there is to know. I want to taste the bitter. So he partook of flesh and blood, as did his brethren. Did it defeat him? No. See, what's the purpose for the illusion? To see the reality. What's the purpose for the darkness? To get to the other side and see the beautiful light. See, everybody's born blind. Why? Because we sinned? Because we deserve it? Because we're being punished? Jesus said no, for the glory of God to be revealed. Go baptize yourself in the River Jordan 7 times, and your eyes will be opened. You got to go down through the experience of these lower carnal forces. Go through the emotions and conquer the beast in the sea and the Jonah in the whale for 3 days and 3 nights. Jesus wasn't conquered by it. No. He wasn't defeated. He defeated the darkness. So let me clarify. The darkness is not true. It's not real. We don't live in the darkness. We live in the light. But we are aware of the darkness. We have been there. We've gone through it and we've conquered it. And Jesus definitely conquered the darkness. So, we've been talking about the names of God and the names of the devil. You've got, in the Old Testament, you have this God, YHWH, that we've explained is vowels. Josephus says they're vowels. And those vowels were the letters that manifest the consonants. So we create our reality by words. And Jesus is the word or the expression of the Father. And through him, by him, and for him, all things were created. That's that Christ, the only begotten. Because the darkness isn't begotten of God. It's an illusion. So, the only begotten, the only expression of the Father is the perfect reality. It's the light. It's the world as it's meant to be. So, all things were created through Christ, through the Word. And remember, the Christ is in you. And we're babes in Christ, and he wants to produce us he's waiting that Christ might be formed in us, the Apostle Paul said. Because we have an inner man that's growing from day to day. And the outer man, or the carnal, is dying. These are all the symbols and words that the New Testament and the Old Testament are about. They're just words to help us comprehend why we have to suffer, who we are, where we're going. So the only begotten of the Father is the perfect world, the perfect Son. The carnal son, or this illusion, that weak and beggarly child that's crippled and dying, laden down with sin, that's not our Father's Son. You're not that son. We don't identify with that. We're no part of the flesh. We're no part of this world. We know no man after the flesh anymore. We were once children of darkness, the Apostle Paul said. We were drunkards and liars and whatever. We've done all those things. We've had many lives. We've been baptized in the river 7 times, or as many times, over and over and over again, until the end, till the Sabbath, until it rests, until we're finished. We got plenty of time, because our Father in heaven isn't willing that any should perish, but he's patient. Each day is like 1,000 years to him. He's got time. He's not willing that any should perish. He gives us all time. He has a plan, and his plan is perfect, and everyone will achieve their perfect plan, their purpose. So, the Old Testament then has different names for God and lots of parables. What happened was, it was written as a parable to help us understand. For those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. Then it will teach us this grand philosophical truth, so that we know who we are. But for many, Jesus said they didn't understand. Even though they had ears and they had eyes, they couldn't understand, because they didn't use their spiritual eyes. To the physical, untrained eye, words on a page can be misunderstood. And some of these little parables maybe seem harsh and cruel. This angry God on his mountain. You say, what kind of a God is that? We don't worship that God. Well, then, because people didn't understand, and they began to reason that, well, we have to have justice, and so people have to be punished because they're all evil. And, if the Bible says that this God's angry and he's punishing people, and they didn't know it represented the hard, sorry situation we live in, the carnal forces of nature that are hard, gravity, and you can't disobey it or it'll splat all over the ground. They couldn't comprehend this parable about the ego being a hard taskmaster. And so they just said, well, if you've got to be good to be saved, I know I must be good, because I know God must love me. So who's the evil? Well, it must be you, because you made a mistake, and I'm not going to forgive you, because the Bible, the God of this Old Testament, he wouldn't pardon their sins till the 3rd and the 4th generation. He was a jealous God, a God of vengeance. And so they began to think, oh, here's his laws, and if you don't keep his laws, you're going to die. And you must stone your own mother if she breaks one of the commandments. So they began to pattern their government after this parable that they didn't understand. And the Catholic Church stoned people and hated people, and went and carried on the same practice that they did in the days of the Old Testament, where there was going after this law of an eye for an eye. Jesus said very clearly, I don't want you to go by that law. I want you to give, and you shall receive. It's a higher law. But people get caught up and they see a contradiction, and a lot of times they'll choose between the two. Maybe they can't grasp love. They've never been loved. And then if they did see that parable, or, a parable that talked about love somehow, or they heard the actual literal words of Christ telling us to love one another, they'd get hung up on these other verses that talk about hellfire and damnation and wrath of God and all this stuff, and they couldn't distinguish. And of course, there was an ulterior motive, because there were individuals in the world that wanted to rule over others, and they wanted us to keep us in fear. So they never explained to us the parables. They never explained to us that the Old Testament God was the ego. That mankind has always had this big parable in every nation. The Greeks had the Olympians. And many of these gods and their names are related. No matter what language or nation you're in, we've got Jesus calling his father Uranus. That's the Greek pantheon, the father of the gods. It's not like he meant Yahweh. No, he didn't mean Yahweh. And if he did, he wouldn't have said Yahweh, because Yahweh doesn't correspond to Uranus in the Greek pantheon. Yahweh's not the first of the gods or the highest of the gods. Yahweh's down there at the bottom of the wheel. That corresponds to the God of this world. The lower realm with his 10 commandments. You get into esoteric wisdom and it talks about the 10 Sephiroth, which is the 10 splendors that go forth and manifest the physical universe. And so in the Bible you have these parables, this gematria and all of this numerology. It all goes back to this ancient wisdom. See, Israel, they may have worshipped Yahweh down in the lower part of Canaan. But in the upper part, the 10 tribes up there in Samaria and at Bethel, they didn't worship the same way. There was a higher understanding of these things. And it's all interwoven there in the Old Testament, as we've been talking about how, Rachel and her sister Leah, because Yah is the lower and El is the higher. And so Jacob had these 2 wives, and he became divided at Gilead. And they made a pillar, and it was a witness that the higher Rachel, where he went to the north up to Haran, where Rachel took these gods of the higher realm with her. But when they went down over the river Jordan, went back into this land of Canaan, they never worshipped that God. They worshipped the God of the Canaanites. Yah was the lower, the moon god that ruled over the night. The Egyptians worshipped Yah. The Canaanites worshipped Yah. The Sumerians called him Ea, sometimes Enki. There were all these gods. Remember, in Greek mythology, you have Poseidon, Hades, and Zeus. Well, Zeus got the sky, and Poseidon got the ocean, and Hades got the underworld. And he had a key. Well, in the book of Revelation, there is a bottomless pit, or an abyssios. Yahweh was the god of the abyssios. Ea, in the Sumerian legend, was the god of the abyssios, the Abzu. In Greek, Hades had a key. Poseidon had a trident. And Zeus had a thunderbolt. Well, in the Old Testament, you have all the same stuff. And there in the book of Revelation, chapter 9, you see this god Abaddon. Abi is father. Adon, which is 750 times, in the Old Testament. And many times it's talking about Yahweh. Adon. They say, it just means Lord. Well, that was a Greek god, Adon. And depending on the tense, you could say Adon, Adoni, Adonai, but it's still Adon. And the Greeks had Adoni, and the Egyptians had Adoni, and the Hebrews had Adoni. It was their god on the bottom of the wheel. Father Adon is the father of destruction, the god of perdition. He had the key to the bottomless pit, like Hades. All of these gods are in the Bible. But we've come to understand that there's God and then there's the devil. We never really understand that devil is also the word God. Diva, it comes from the Latin deus. And, Zeus is that same word. They came to understand it as the word divine, theos or deus. We'll talk about that in a little while. Diva, it was a spirit or a being or God. Deity. All the kings of Israel represented parts of the astrological world. David is Daoud, and that's also Hebrew for deity, dea, which we get the word day. We'll talk about that in a minute. But all of this is in the Old Testament, just like it's in the Greek, just like it's in the Sumerian, just like it's in the Egyptian. Set, Satan. You've got the Latin, Saturn. And today we call him Satan. Well, he's the god at the bottom of the wheel. They had a big celebration on December 25th, or December 21st. The birth of Saturnalius. Question is if we don't, if the high God or the Father of heaven that Jesus worshiped, he said to the Jews, your father's the devil. He's from beneath, from below, the underworld. And you wish to do the desires of your father, because that's that lower carnal nature. And the Bible calls him the God of this world. And in Thessalonians, as we read yesterday, the Apostle Paul says he is the God that sets himself up in the temple, proclaiming and declaring himself to be God. Well, you have a temple. That's the universe. This is your body. You have different places. You have the most holy and the outer courtyard. And you see, the Jewish people, when Moses came down off the mountain, they were worshiping this golden calf because Moses was taking too long. So they decided who they were going to worship, gold. And they began to worship it in the form of this carnal nature, of the animal nature, the astrological wheel. And they set up this bull with the eagle's wings, which is the cherub or the cherubim that was in the most holy, near the curtain before you go into the most holy. And they put the blood of the blood of the covenant upon it. They didn't realize they were worshiping this brute Baphomet, Saturnalius or Capricorn, which is the beast god with a fishtail, down at the bottom of the wheel. And the mountain Sinai, which is the Hebrew letter Shin, which is that word sign, means the moon. It wasn't the God up above, it was the God beneath the mountain. The point, the peak of that mountain, so you go down and then you start going back up from December 21st. The peak is there at the winter solstice. And that's where the birth of Saturnalius was. So they didn't realize that there were these different gods as time went on. Set, when the sun sets, you see, that's the darkness. So, the Judeans, they were down at the Dead Sea, which is the lowest place on earth. Jesus had to go partake of flesh and blood, and he came down and descended far below all things. What is it that he ascended, but that he descended first into the lower regions of the earth? And he kept saying, look, it's not my time. I'm the sun. The sun rises at a certain time. I can't do miracles yet. You guys are living in darkness. You're down there and celebrating the Feast of Dedication in the winter time. In the Feast of Tabernacles, when the sun goes down, in the fall equinox, the autumn equinox. He says, I'm the Lord, I'm the sun that shines from the east and shines all the way into the west. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. I am the light. We are the children of the day, not the children of the night. All of this is explained in the Old Testament. And we've come to understand that the YHWH, Yah, is the God at the bottom of the wheel. The illusion, the Satan, the darkness. He's got his 10 commandments. He's ruthless. He's a vengeful God. He's the God of armies, the God of war. He teacheth David's hands for warfare. So what was the Old Testament God of heaven Well, it's not a Greek. It's Hebrew. It's not written in Greek. So what did the Hebrews call the God of heaven? Did they talk about it in the Old Testament? All the time. First of all, Genesis chapter 1 is Elohim. That's the plural. Gods. Let us make man in our image. Nowhere in the Greek or the Sumerian or the Egyptian was there ever just one God that created man. It was a collaboration, because we're made spiritually and physically. But you could say that the first chapter of Genesis is talking about the spiritual creation of man originally. The second chapter of Genesis introduces Yahweh, and he doesn't create, he forms man from the dust, from the elemental. So Elohim then is not the name of the Father. But why is it that the gods are called Elohim? Because El was the father of the gods. Now, that doesn't mean he's the high father. Remember, there are fathers above father. I mean, Zeus was the father of the gods, but his father was Kronos, and Kronos' father was Uranus. And it goes on and on and on. Before Uranus, according to the Sumerians, Anu, or Uranu in the Greek, but Anu had a father. And so it just goes on and on and on. But, you see, you can't continue. You can imagine the universe could be broken down. You could take an atom and split it, and maybe there'd be particles like photons, and then beyond that, ions or whatever. But, it's good enough to understand that the world can be broken down into atoms. You could say, well, the world's made of atoms, and you'd be right. But it might be made of photons. Okay? So we don't need to get, that deep. We don't have to get that scientific about it. The God that we worship is the God of heaven. See, Anu means heaven. And Or means light. So the Greeks basically were worshiping something even higher than the heaven. The light's higher than the heavens. It's the high God. And they also talk about, in the New Testament, talk about Theos, and that's something we're going to get into. But in the Old Testament, we've got El, and we've got El Elyon. So it just says, El Elyon just means God Most High. And then there's El Shaddai. Shaddai means Almighty. Now, there are times in the Old Testament, this is why it gets very difficult to explain this, because you've got different manuscripts. You've got Israelites who wrote some of the scriptures, because remember, Israel split up into two kingdoms, Judah and Israel. Israel was in the north, and they were lost. Even down to the days of Jesus in the New Testament, it says that, go ye unto the lost tribes of Israel, the lost 10 tribes. Judah was a nation built of the 2 tribes of Benjamin and Judah, and part of Levi, because, excuse me, the Levites went, part of the Levites went with Judah, and some of them went with the 10 tribes, because they didn't have a heritage. They didn't have an inheritance, so they weren't really a tribe. They were just the priests. So as far as the inheritance, the tribes that got inheritances, there were 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. And they were down there in the southern part of Canaan. And so they were symbolic of the lower nature, and they could only see or understand the ego and these 10 commandments and this vengeance. The higher part, they understood, supposedly they had symbols and some understanding of a higher God. So after the diaspora, or when Assyria came and took Israel away in 722 BC, they never returned. But Babylonians came and took the Judahites away, in the kingdom of Judah, took them away in about 600 BC. They did return. So they still know who they are in the world. They're not lost. And so when you talk about the Jews, you're talking about not all of Israel, but just those who remember who they were, those who were of the lower kingdom. And so they're the ones who were left holding all these manuscripts and gathering them all together. Not really understanding all of it, because they had been scattered for 70 years. And when they came back, it took a long time to gather all this stuff. Even in the days of Ezra, they were still the scribes were trying to put all this back together. They were very faithful in trying to preserve it and write it as best they could. But remember, there were always forces trying to hide things from you. So the teachers never came along that were able to teach you the meaning of these things. But our Father in heaven made it so that we still have these ancient writings. I mean, even though bad people come along and burn them, well, we'll dig them up in the latter days, right? We've dug up the Nag Hammadi Library, the Dead Sea Scrolls. We've been digging up, since for the last 200 years, we've been digging up these ancient manuscripts and beginning to interpret them by divine intervention, so that we can go back now and understand these things. Even if the Catholic Church said it was anathema if you study on your own, or if you learn the wisdom, right, and don't listen to the, priest or whatever. For a long time, they didn't even want you to read the Bible, but people like Jerome and Huss and, individuals came along and, Tyndale and Wycliffe and stuff, and they translated these writings. So therefore, we had the opportunity, it was after the Dark Ages and the Age of Enlightenment, we began to find out, there's words, scripture, we can read them for ourselves. For a long time, they just interpreted it for us. So, of course, they didn't understand any of this. We had to sort of reinvent all this ancient wisdom. Even in physics, Sir Isaac Newton started studying this ancient esoteric wisdom. He wrote far more about spiritual matters than he did about science, but we're never told this. So they began to put it back together. They had to reinvent the wheel because ancient ones knew all of this information. And they knew this was all parables. The Greeks understood that Zeus was a parable. They didn't really get down on their knees and worship a bearded man with a thunderbolt in the sky. Now, there were those who did this, and this was called religion. Religion began to worship four-footed beasts and idols, and that was idolatry. But there were Greeks who weren't idolaters. They understood the meanings, and there were Hebrews that were not idolaters. However, down there in Judea, they were all idolaters because they didn't understand who they worshipped at all. And Jesus tried to explain it to them in parables. So in the Old Testament, who is God? Well, we've got Adonai, which I've said means destruction. Yahweh always calls himself many times Yahovah Adonai. So that's down at the bottom of the wheel. If you look in the Revelation chapter 9, it says he calls him Abaddon, or Father Edon. And it says in Greek he has the name of Apollyon. Well, if you look up in Greek this god Apollyon, you'll find he's the sun. What? What is, we just got through saying that Yahweh is the darkness down at the bottom of the wheel. How could he also be the sun? Well, because, the sun is in the sky, and then when the sun goes down at the bottom of the wheel, then it becomes winter. And so at the bottom of the wheel, it's Apollyon, or destruction. Remember, the Apostle Paul, his name was originally Saul. Saul means sun. Some languages, the sun was Sol. We have many words that's come down to us from that. Salutations comes from Saul. You take your hand and put it at the top of your head, and you salute. That's the top of your head. You point to the top of your head. That's the sun. So, salute is another way of doing that in another language. It would be hail. Hail to the chief. You salute. And you say, hail. Hello. Hello comes from the word helios. In Greek, that's the sun. And in Hebrew, it's El. So, El is another name for the sun, or Sol. Remember, Sol, Oman. Oman is the moon. See? So, all of these words are connected. So, Paul was later called Saul, then he was called Paul, which means destruction. And there in 2 Thessalonians, where Paul says the son of destruction, he uses the word Apollyon, the son of destruction, who declares himself to be God, who sits in the temple of God. You see, there were always the two sides. There was the conquering sun that gave life, that was in the sky, that was the summer, and then there was the winter sun, which is the birth of Saturnalia, down at the bottom of the wheel. And that was Apollonius. So, Paul changed his name, or his name was changed. It's a symbol to explain to us that when Paul was on the road to Damascus, he saw the blinding light of Christ, and he became a Christian. But in order to teach us, he had to write it into words. He became a teacher. Once it comes out of your mouth, it's not directly light from God. The letter of the law killeth. So basically, putting it down in words or a parable means that you veiled it. And then you became someone who's more or less a person who is putting it in darkness. It's a veil. Moses did the same thing. He went up to Mount Horeb, which is orb, light, and he brought the law of love. The people didn't want that. They started worshiping a gold and a golden calf, and all. They wanted a priesthood. So Jethro, or Ruel, his name was Ruel. See, they all have different names. Ruel is the good side of that priesthood, and Jethro is the bad side when he told Moses how to make a priesthood. So they darkened it, and they said, okay, Moses, veil your face and go down there, because you can't communicate with these people. They don't understand the light. So veil your face, and they want a priesthood, give it to them. Right? They don't want to directly go to God. They can't see the light. They can't bear it. So he veiled his face. And Paul, when he wrote the New Testament, veiled these truths as well. But not so veiled as Moses did. Paul's had some very clear words, as does Moses at times. But for the most part, Jesus would not speak but through parables. And he veiled it for those who could not hear with their inner ear. So Apollos means the darkness at the bottom of the wheel. And that's why Abaddon, the father who has the key to the pit, is Apollyon, the sun. You got two sides of every coin, friends. So El is the top of the wheel. And going to the New Testament then, who is God? What is the name in the Old Testament or in the New Testament for God? Well, it's there very clearly. It's very strange. It's always been a huge puzzle to me, even before I even understood all these things. I used to think, well, because I was raised as Jehovah's Witness, most of you know. And even then, when I really believed that, I used to say, well, why didn't the New Testament have the name Yahweh in the Bible? If Jesus worshiped Yahweh and he was the true God, why does it always say Uranus in the Greek? And nobody ever really answered that. I guess the answer that came sort of to mind, and we just went with it, was that, well, they really wanted to write it in Hebrew, and then they would have put Yahweh, but, they weren't writing in Hebrew, so for some reason the Jews were taken into captivity and they came out speaking Greek, so therefore I guess we got to use Greek gods, and stuff. What? If the Greek gods were pagans, it's like saying, if you believe Uranus, according to the Greeks, or Zeus was a devil, then why in the world would the apostles, the holy inspiration of God, writing these words, why would they write down Satan in place of it? Oh, well, we're in a different language, so we've got to use their God now, Satan. We'll just write Satan everywhere. Because Uranus is not Satan. See, Jesus was saying to them, your God's the devil. He was explaining these parables. They didn't understand El Elyon. They didn't know Adonai. They didn't know what these words mean. They had forgotten. So Jesus was someone who knew what he was talking about. He spoke of things that he understood. And Nicodemus says, I don't understand these things. And Jesus said, you're a Jew and you're on the Sanhedrin and you don't know these things? You've got to be born again. And he's like, no, I don't know. Tell me, teach me. How will I know unless someone teaches me? So, when the inspired Bible writers wrote, they didn't write in Hebrew. We have not one manuscript from the ancient New Testament that was ever found written in Hebrew. We've got a a version in Aramaic, but it was translated from the Greek for the Aramaic-speaking Christians. But it's not written in Hebrew. All the most ancient manuscripts are written in Greek. And they all say Uranus is God. Jesus calls that his Father. So we translate it Father in heaven. But in Greek it's Pater Uranos, Father Uranus. That's exactly what they would say if you were Greek. You know, these supposed pagans, they would go around saying, oh, Father Uranus, right? Sometimes they would say Theos. So, many times in the Old Testament, or in the New Testament, you've got Jesus calling his Father Uranus. And many other times it just says generically God, Theos. Now, if you look that up, you're going to find people who will say, well, we don't know what Theos really means. It has nothing to do with Zeus, of course. Well, it sounds like Zeus, but it's not really Zeus. And somebody else might say, oh, well, you know, it's another spelling of Zeus. Well, what is it? Well, you have to understand that everything has come down to us from the lens of the Christian. Remember the Romans, the Latin, they became the entire nation. It was mandatory. It was illegal to be anything but Christian. So everything that we understand today is from that lens, going back to the Latin Vulgate of the Bible. They translated everything from that. So going back to the Greek, we've got to go back to classical Greek and try to figure out what everything's mean. It's just very, very complicated. So in Latin, Zeus is Jupiter. You say, well, who's Jupiter? Why Jupiter? If the Greeks, they're so close to one, the language is similar and stuff. And well, because Pater means father. Remember, Jesus called him Pater Uranos. Well, the Latins called him Jew Pater. Jew is Deus. Deus is the Latin way of saying Theos. And so, the meaning of Jupiter is Father Zeus. That's what it means. I mean, you can look that up in any dictionary. The Latins called their god Jupiter, or O Father Zeus. And therefore, you can prove by that Jew or Deus, the Latin Deus, is the same as the Greek Zeus. So, it depends on which Greek language you're going back to. Since this is an ancient understanding, I mean, everything in the Greek uses Theos for the gods, because it doesn't matter whether it's theosophy or theology or theogony, right? I mean, all these words come from Theos, and it all means the study of the gods. But it's not using the Greek, Koine Greek, which is Theos. It's using a different, the Attic Greek and the Dorian Greek. Like the Attic Greek is the Greek all the way back to Athens. Now, in the Attic Greek, it's D-Z-E-U-S, Zeus. Not just Zeus, but Zeus. So the Latins get their Deus from the Attic Greek. So that's why it's so difficult, because we've got a book that's thousands of years old coming down from various traditions. Through a Latin Bible, through a Greek tradition, through classical Greek, all the way back to the Athenian Greeks. And so, it became a phrase, Deus, meant God, Zeus, because he was the father of the gods. And remember, he wasn't the father of the father of the father of the gods, because Zeus's father was Kronos, which is the Latin Saturn, which is Satan. And Saturn, or Kronos, which is Ea, Yah, his father was Uranus. Well, it's interesting because Uranus and Gaia gave birth to someone named Hyperion. Hyperion and Thea gave birth to Helios. And Helios was just one of 3 children. The other one was named Selene, which is the moon. Helios was the sun. And so, if you're following this Greek mythology as they understood it, they've got the father, excuse me, the father of the gods is Uranus, who gives birth to Hyperion, Hyper, or the High One, who gives birth to the sun, Helios, or El of the Hebrews, Halo, Hullo, Salute, Saul. Remember Saul in the Bible, who was the first king of Israel. And then later on they got David, Daoud, or divine, or deity, or Deus. It's the same. All these words mean the same things, but you've got to go back and try to figure out the etymology. Sometimes it's very difficult. But this is the problem that we have now that we're 2,000 years later from Christ. And I'm sorry, but this is the problem we have. So determining what they meant by God is a little bit more difficult than just what meets the eye. So Helios then was the god, or the sun, and the sun was always the god that reigns. You know, the Zeus who reigned over Mount Olympus. Elopios is El, or Helios, Elohim, the gods, the 12 original gods. So, Jesus then, who is he in the Old Testament? Because it doesn't say Jesus in the Old Testament, but we know that Jesus was there because Psalms 110 says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit thou at my right hand. Remember, there's two gods, one sits at the left and one sits at the right. One's above and one's below. Jesus said to the Jews, why do you say that the Christ, the coming one, me, myself, why do you say I am David's son? Have you not read the scripture? Yahweh, or Jehovah, saith unto my Lord, David calls him my Lord. If David calls him my Lord, how is he his son? So you see, Jehovah and David's Lord, two different lords, and he says, sit thou at my right hand. Yahweh says to the Messiah, the other Lord, sit at my right hand. So Yahweh sitting at the left. So there's these two gods that rule both sides of the wheel. So in the Old Testament, we know then that the name of, Jehovah's Witnesses went around telling everybody that God was Jehovah, English Jehovah. So we're all very familiar with that. They published pamphlets and tracts and books, scattered them all around the world, even though the Bible, before, Jehovah's Witness came along, before they invented or supposedly made up their version of the Bible and published it and made it the most, the widest selling Bible in the world, and supposedly put the name of Jehovah back in the Bible. Before that, Christians knew, they had an idea that their God was different. They didn't go by the Old Testament. They went by the New. And they worshiped Jesus. They were Christians. But Jehovah's Witnesses confused people and got them going back to the Old Testament God. But you see, they had it. It was easy to do because the Catholics already burned all the libraries and killed all the wizards. The grand wizard, the wise one. And the witches, the wise women. And burned all their books. And made it anathema to teach anything other than what they demanded. So it was easy for them to be confused. Nobody understood. Well, all these names of God in the Old Testament, they didn't have them there. The Jews, for, hundreds of years, thousands, took out the name of God, and then when they put him back, we don't know where they put him, but remember, the Jews had their version of the Bible, and they were worshiping the God at the bottom of the wheel, and so they just sometimes applied El to their God. Even though if you read the verse very carefully, you'd see it was a parable, and it was talking about two different gods. We find that with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, all the way down. Abraham meets El Elyon and Melchizedek, and they just have bread and wine and communion and a promise, no law. And the law that came 430 years later through Yahweh, or Jehovah, there was sacrifices and blood and vengeance and death. You got to do something. And that God, Jehovah, met Abraham and demanded to kill his own son. The darkness wants a sacrifice. It wants you to pay a price. So in the Old Testament, Jesus was El. And his father was El Elyon, El Shaddai. But in the New Testament, it's very clear. It's written right there for you. Uranos was his father, was Jesus' father. Okay, well, who was Jesus? Who did Uranus give birth to? In the Sumerian tablets, it says Anu had a son named Ea. And then he had another child. Enlil in the Sumerian tablets is also a form of El. But this gets very difficult because remember, you're looking at the 12 houses in the wheel. And so the top of the wheel would be Anu, heaven. Enlil was like Zeus. And the bottom of the wheel would be houses, lower houses, like Hades and Poseidon and these gods at the bottom of the wheel. But the sun is something completely different. It rules over the house. And some of these gods in the lower part or the lower houses would swallow up the sun. So sometimes when you're talking about a god, he may not even be a god that's part of the 12. He may be the sun, as in the case of Apollyon, or El, or Helios. So Olympus is the mountain. It's a pinnacle, and around the base of the mountain, there's 12 houses, and these 12 gods that rule on the mountain. So it gets very difficult then to distinguish some of these because you're not familiar with all of this. It wouldn't be that hard if you understood cosmology and theology the way that the ancients did. But we were taught a very different system. There was just God, and then there was the devil, and everything, we didn't understand all of this. So in the Old Testament, Yahweh is Ea, the son of a god. Now, you'll find that in the Old Testament, but you got to look really hard. Deuteronomy 32, in the Septuagint version, it says, the Most High, El Elyon, divided up the world into 70 nations, 72 nations, and Yahweh's lot fell upon Judah. So there were 72 gods, and this is what we have in astrology. We've got 72 deacons. 3 of these deacons in each of the houses, 12 houses, that's 36. And there's day and night. It goes around twice. So 36 and 36 is 72. There's the 72 gods. There's 24 elders around God's throne in the book of Revelation. All this fits harmoniously. So the high god that we talked about, Hyperion, and whose father was Anu, heaven, the high god, Anu, or Uranos, is just what the Greeks call it, Uranos. Or the Sumerians, Anu. But in the Hebrew, it's the word high is Elyon. So Elyon is Uranos, sometimes called Almighty, Shaddai. But that's a title. If you look at the book of Psalms, half of the book of Psalms is got, David's talking to Elyon. And Daniel hardly mentions Yahweh at all. It's all about Elyon. Because remember, Daniel was taken to Babylon, became the head of the Magi. And he was preaching this higher law. So, you've got to really rightly divide all of this. So in the New Testament, God is Zeus, the reigning God, Jesus. Of course, his father is Uranos. Now, if I, in my videos, go around and start telling people, oh, I worship Uranos or Zeus or something, people are going to click off because we're Christians here. And we don't understand that Zeus, Latin Jupiter, is Father Zeus, which is Deus, which is the same, it's come down to us as Theos from the Attic Greek, and that is a form of the name Zeus. And it became sort of a general term in classic Greek for the god. So, because the New Testament was written in classical Koine Greek, the common Greek, they just used the word that everybody used for God. But it's clear there that Theos' father is Uranos. So wait a minute, if Jesus is Zeus, then why would Jesus be talking and quoting Zeus? Well, because you see, Jesus was Zeus before he lived as Jesus. And he may be quoting verses and use the word Zeus to quote it. Sometimes they would use the word Kyrios, which is, in Greek, that was a word that meant, it just meant the lord or the master of a house, one who had a family, who owned a manor, which means master or lord. So, Kyrios is not the name of a god necessarily, unless, because remember, Hyperion not only gave birth to Helios, the sun, and Selene, the moon, but they also gave birth to Kyrios, which is a different word altogether. So that wouldn't have anything, that wouldn't be, they have different cognates, and it's not the same word. The only place we can find the word Kyrios is the way they used it in classical Greek, and it just simply means to be master or lord. So that's not necessarily a particular name of a god. But Helios is definitely the name of a god. It was the Greek god for the sun. And this is the word that the Old Testament uses for God when it says El. And so that would be, now remember, so is Jesus Zeus or is he El? Because remember, Zeus is one of the 12 houses, and then he ends up becoming the father of the gods. Well, the sun is not one of the houses. The sun rules over the houses. Well, you see, these are all parables. Jesus is both the sun who rules over the houses, and he is one of the houses up in the higher part of the wheel. So, Zeus was the youngest son of Kronos, which is in Latin Saturn, which is in Egyptian is Set, and which we call Satan. Because Ea was the eldest son of Anu in the Sumerian. And Ea is our Yahweh, who is the one who ruled the world first until El became ruler. So, when you say, is Jesus, the sun, was definitely the sun all the way through. It says, like Horus, Hor, which would be light. So, some of these gods are like the word Dios means day, Hor means light, and Sol means sun, or El means sun. So they have similar words. The word Deus and Dia and David and divine and all these words, deity, Theos, Zeus, they all have to do with seeing. See, we get the word theater from viewing. It has the connotation of viewing something. The theater or theosophy is to view spiritual things. So thea means to view or to make light or to see. So and we get the word day or dia from that. Remember, in the New Testament, it tells us that Dios is light. It says it right there. But we're like, oh, that's Greek and we're English and, it's like aliens and we don't understand any of this. It's literally telling you all you need to know, but you don't speak Greek. Dia is light. It tells you that. And of course, this is very confusing. So would I say that Jesus is Zeus? Well, I'd be laughed out of town and, hung on a stake if I did. But that's one of in the Greek pantheon that represented all the things that Jesus did. Remember, Zeus sent the evil titans into the Tartarus. That's what Jesus does. Everything that Zeus did, Jesus did. Right? He ruled in place as the heir of his father Uranus. That's exactly what Jesus says. My father is Uranus. There's no other way to get around it. But Jesus also represented the sun in its righteousness that shall reign. Jesus kept saying, it's not my time. The sun rises in the morning, Mom. And it's still, you know, they're worshiping down there at the festival of dedication. Even the word festival comes from the word deus. Thea, festive, is to go and have a feast on a particular day. It's from the word dia. But Jesus said, I'm not going to go down to the festival of dedication in the middle of winter. That's not my time. My time is in the morning. And it says, you'll see the Son of Man rising in the east and shining all the way into the west. So shall the parousia, or the presence of the Son of Man, be. And he shall rise like the sun with healing in his wings. So Jesus then is many things in these Greek parables. I mean, in one place he's Perseus, which is one of the sons of Hyperion. And they name, you know, Perseus, remember Jason and the Argonauts? There were many people that redid these stories. The stories even changed a little bit. You got, the Odyssey and the Iliad, Homer, you know, and he put a lot of this down and tried to explain a lot of it. Nobody ever reads the book of the Iliad or the Odyssey, because if you really got that down, you'd probably understand the New Testament pretty well. Because you need to understand these names, because the Greek New Testament's written in Greek. But in Jason and the Argonauts, you've got Jesus representing several different people there. Hercules, the strong man who defeats the devil, that's Jesus. So Jesus is Hercules. Perseus, who goes and saves the bride Andromeda, that's Jesus, right? But then the guy that, Jason's got the Argonaut, remember, he's not an astronaut. He's not a cosmonaut, but he's an Argonaut, an ark. He has a boat. So he's sailing around the great Oceanus. The 12 astrological signs. And so Jason is another way of saying Jesus. Because the tense of the word, you can say Jason, Jesus, Jesu. It's the same word. He goes to get the golden fleece. The golden fleece is the ram, which is Aries, which in the Latin is Deus. So Jesus is the Deus, the Zeus. And sometimes he's called Jason, and sometimes he's called Ius, I-E-S, without the un on the end or the tense of the word, just like Apollyon is Paul. So this makes it very difficult. You've got scholars that's supposed to be scholars and supposed to understand all this stuff, and they're not understanding. They say, oh, Adonai is different than Adoni. Different word. No, it isn't. It's a different tense of the same word. And yet they don't know this? No, they're trying to hide it from you. Unless they're stupid, and I think many of them are. But Jason and Jesus is the same word, and then you've got Perseus. In the boat, you've got Hercules and Dionysius. That's also another name for Jesus. Another function that Jesus played out and fulfilled, just like Jesus fulfilled Old Testament prophecy. Well, it's the same thing. He fulfilled all of the Greek mythology as well. And that's what it is. These things represent something philosophical. They're explanations of the divine comedy that we live in. And so Jesus was both the Son, and he was the Zeus in the heaven that ruled over the 12 signs of the zodiac. He was the Perseus. He was the Jason. He was the Hercules, the strong man who conquered the serpent. He was all of these things. So anyway, I'm going to leave it there because I see we're up over an hour. And dogs are barking and they got people walking by. So I'm going to go ahead and go, friends. We'll take this up again and talk more about this because I know that you're all interested in this. But we'll leave it there and we'll get right back into this tomorrow. We'll see you guys again. Have a good day.